Abracadabra. Gonna reach out and grab you.
I definitely was not expecting that to be the abracadabra that you sang this morning.
I know.
True.
Yeah, that's
Well, that's
the...
when people say grab ya, that's the song that pops into my head. If you said abracadabra, it would be abracadabra.
If you said abracadabra, abra una na, I would definitely be thinking about Lady Gaga.
There's no question.
I am happy that we returned to the era where Lady Gaga was saying stuff that only makes sense to her. That's my
Nonsense
favorite.
lyrics. Nobody does it better.
Yes.
Let's do a nonsense podcast.
Let's do a nonsense podcast. It's time for Sound Politics. This is Sound Politics. I'm Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Dankman. And joining us today is Olympia correspondent Jeannie Lindsay, truly the third chair host of Sound Politics. Jeannie,
right.
Thanks for being here.
I'm so honored. Thank you for having me.
Of course, the governor signed the final slate of bills and the state's operating budget and transportation budget this week. And trigger warning, if you're not into office supplies or you've ever been trapped in an Office Depot, Scott really wanted to talk about the pens that he used.
The pens.
Well, the governor and Scott have that in common. The governor has been talking about pens pretty much every bill signing I've been to in the past several weeks. So you're not alone, Scott.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I want to talk about, right? And I mean, I promise this will connect to what we're talking about today.
Sure.
Ferguson is not, it will, I promise. Ferguson is not your typical governor in many ways, including his pens. And we're laughing, but the governor's signatory pen is important. When he signs a bill, he gives the pen to someone who was instrumental in passing it or who wrote it.
Or someone's multiple times. He'll give those out.
Yeah, he will often. They're sometimes they're kind of fancy, right? The oldest one I saw a picture of was Governor Albert Rossellini's pen from the 60s. That was black, tapered on both sides, sleek, what looked like a gold pewter band and lettering. I went deep
very
on the
classy
pens.
Sounding.
I was going to say, that's a very vivid description of a pen.
Thank you. Theater of the mind, even when it comes to pens. So, and then we had Governor Gary Locke on a few weeks ago. He and many of his predecessors going back to like the 70s, they had a white ballpoint pen, which looks, kind of clean because it has a black signature on it. So it's like a white pen that is signed in black ink. Governor Gregoire switched it up. She went back to black. Inslee stayed with the black. But Bob Ferguson said,
not good enough.
I talked to him after an event at the port yesterday, and he gave me one of his pens. And Libby,
yeah, hand it over. Let me see this thing.
Let me
you guys have been talking about this.
Describe it for me.
Okay, it is very primary color blue on the outside, plastic, and we have a Bob Ferguson signature in silver, and Governor Bob Ferguson with a picture of the state of Washington. I'm sorry, Scott, but after a lot of talk, this thing just looks like you walked into an office supply store and picked up the first Bic pen.
Yeah, that's right.
There is a felt tip. I mean, it's nice.
It's felt tip, which hasn't been done since the 80s. I told you I went deep, or rather the Secretary of State's office went deep with me. There's a pen nerd there. So I asked Ferguson what you're saying, why he wanted a pen that looks like the most basic thing at Staples. And here's what he said.
I've been given sort of the old ballpoint pens in the past, but they often don't really work that well. So we feel it's a practical pen as well, and we're all about running a practical government.
Practicality.
I think he's nervous about flying his pen nerd flag, and he's trying to really play this as this is just the right decision for the state of Washington.
I pulled him aside, and he was like, I don't know if I'm going to have much to say, but then it turned out he did have a lot to say. And so here's the connection. Here's the connection. For the last 3 weeks, the question of what Ferguson is going to do with that pen has
Oh, wow, you're actually bringing it home. Okay.
Yes, I always do, Libby. Come on, you doubted me?
I should have trusted you.
What Ferguson is going to do with that pen has been deeply on the minds of everyone, from the business community to the Republicans to especially the Democrats. The question of that pen and whether or not he's going to bring out the other pen, not the blue one, but the red one, the veto pen, which is ballpoint, not felt tip. I asked. We have Jeannie here to talk about all this because she talked to Bob and has covered this, but she also talked to another guy with a lot of pens this week. A guy named Brian Haywood who's going around trying to get people to sign their signatures, or he will about to be going around to get people to sign their signatures to his petitions to undo some of the stuff Ferguson has used his pen to sign into law. First, Jeannie, did you get a pen this week? Because you can't have this one. Sorry.
No, I have a collection of pens at my desk that I have scavenged over time, and I am all set. I looked at the basket of blue Bob Ferguson pens, and I said, you know what? I'm good.
Wow.
I don't even want those pens.
Okay, but seriously, what pen did Governor Ferguson use on the budget? The blue felt-tipped signing pen or the red veto pen?
He actually used multiple blue felt-tipped signing pens. He did use the veto pen very sparingly. He vetoed, I think, he said around $25 million worth of things included in the budget, which in the grand scheme of a $78 billion budget deal is a very small amount. Though
Chicken
I'm sure
scratch.
Yeah, sure. I'm sure for the folks that had the programs that they wanted vetoed, it is a much bigger deal to them. But in the grand scheme of the budget, very small amount. And then he did veto like one part of a revenue bill. There was there's a tax deduction for community banks on residential home loans. Lawmakers included getting rid of that deduction, but the governor vetoed that removal, choosing to keep that deduction in place. So yeah, mostly the blue felt tip action this week.
Let's talk about the revenue side of things, because that's what's getting the most attention today. You know, the governor spent this whole year pushing Democrats in the House and Senate to look for cuts before raising taxes. And as you say, they found some cuts before the veto pen came through and found a little bit more. But this budget package added $9 billion in new revenue over 4 years, Jeannie, including an expanded business and occupation tax. They made the sales tax apply to a lot of services, and it raises a tax on tech companies called the Advanced Computer Surcharge. In the transportation budget, the gas tax is going up 6 cents per gallon, and there's a provision to have it raised every year. So, Jeannie, this was like an anti-tax governor, allegedly. Now he's presiding over the biggest tax increase in state history. Like, what was all this scolding from Ferguson just for show?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. I mean, the reality is that he had a majority legislative Democrats in the Senate and the House at first pitching a giant new wealth tax, which was, I think, upwards of like $21 billion of revenue, which is so much money. And so then he came out and said, no, don't do that. I'm not going to sign it. And so they went back to the drawing board. They renegotiated a $12 billion tax package in the budget. And then he said, no, that's too much. That's not sustainable. And so then they whittled it down to this $9 billion number just for the operating budget, notwithstanding the transportation budget that you just mentioned. So I think that he was sort of the voice in the Democrats' room of, chill out on taxes a little bit. But ultimately, yeah, he did sign this more than $9 billion in tax increases. And so I think that, part of it was maybe for some show, but I think that ultimately the effect of it was that we didn't see a $21 billion tax increase. So that is significant, but ultimately he did align with the final version that the legislative Democrats sent him. I do think that, there were people who were really hopeful that his talk about a cuts first approach, right? Like he emphasized cuts so much anytime he would talk about the budget. I think I wrote a story that was like, no new taxes for now. He wasn't even talking about taxes. He wouldn't. And so I think he left all of that tax conversation to the legislature. He wasn't the one driving those conversations or really involved in it other than to say, calm down a little bit. But after he said calm down 2 or 3 times or however many times he said it behind closed doors, he was like, all right, you've made billions in cuts as well. So he called it a balanced approach. He also described it as a budget he could work with. So he talked about it not being his favorite budget. He would have probably done something different if he was, the one writing the budget by himself, but it's a team sport, essentially. It's a collaborative effort. And so I think that just knowing how many different people were pushing or pulling on the different components of this budget, I don't think he wanted to put up any more fight over it, especially in his first, 4 months as governor. But we could see that change when he proposes changes to the budget through the supplemental budget process ahead of next year's legislative session. So
we're going to get to that in just a second, Jeannie. I mean, first of all, we had a situation where the governor was talking tough, fiscal hawk energy, earlier in the year. Then the Democrats whittle down their revenue proposals. He starts to go through this line by line. And it sounds like Ferguson came around and said, wow, actually, you guys made some really tough decisions and budgeting is hard after all. Now, Republicans went from kind of having a Ferguson crush going on, thinking that this was going to be a hidden ally in the governor's office, a Democratic fiscal conservative, to being very upset and just feeling like they've been snowed a little bit, right, Jeannie? I mean, how are Republicans responding to the governor's decision to sign all this without any major changes?
Yeah, I mean, the start of the session from the governor's inaugural address and the various meetings that he had with Republicans throughout the session, Republicans kept saying that it's like, wow, a breath of fresh air, a governor that lives on this planet, a governor that, actually talks to us, because Jay Inslee certainly wasn't doing that. So they, I think, were cautious, but there was certainly a lot of optimism. And with the stroke of the multiple pens, he went to, being called the most radical governor in state history. So I think that, when it came to the legislative process, there was a lot of hope, but it was always going to come down to what the governor actually had to do when it was his turn to take action. And now we know.
I feel like when we ask, you've asked, I asked yesterday, we did not just talk about pens, about how he came to this change. Like, how'd he go from anti-tax Bob to sure Bob? I don't know how to say that, but he keeps saying when we ask those questions that he'll watch and pay really close attention to how these taxes play out, at watching for unintended consequences. So, I mean, what would that mean or look like? And is it just talk to appease people who are concerned about, like, the business community, right? Do you think he will actually get rid of some of these taxes next year, maybe?
Well, the reality is that he can't just get rid of taxes that are now law, right? Like there's a whole legislative process that we just went through, and so he'll have to work with lawmakers in order to make adjustments or changes. I mean, it's been really hard to get any sense of what he's thinking or how he is pulling levers behind the scenes, just because he publicly doesn't talk about legislative things as often as his predecessor, and when he does talk about what is going on in the state, it's often through the lens of the pressures coming from the Trump administration and the federal government. So I think that he's really concerned about what's happening at the federal level, and he's clearly trying to, make sure that the state is in a position to weather whatever storm comes from all of that. And so knowing that there are a lot of concerns from a lot of people about these tax increases and changes, because there's just such a wide range of things going on, I think that it would be hard to see an outright repeal or pulling back on some of these, but certainly probably going to be advocating for and talking about and looking at adjustments to be made in case that some of his priorities as governor are being undermined in any way. He's talked a lot about education being a huge priority. Some educators wrote letters to the governor's office urging him to veto the new tax on temporary staffing because of how it could affect special education, right? So it's those sorts of things that maybe there are exemptions that are carved out that he pushes for in the supplemental budget, or other changes that he proposes. But again, it all comes down to he has to work with the legislature in order to actually accomplish any of that.
And that could happen next year with the supplemental budget, some tweaks, but it's unclear what those would be, Jeannie.
Yeah. And when you ask him about specifics about future action, I mean, he uses the phrase like having conversations, or I'm not going to get into those details. So he really keeps things close to chest for whatever reasons he's got. And when you ask him about that aspect, he talks about wanting to not speak before he knows things. But there are a lot of questions about like what he's actually going to do. And he's not really giving a ton of insight publicly about what he's looking at and concerned about right now.
Jeannie, there's been a lot of pushback on these tax increases from conservatives, of course, also more centrist corners like the Seattle Times editorial board. You spoke with one of the most prominent tax critics in the state, Brian Haywood, the man behind Let's Go Washington, those 3 initiatives that voters saw last November, the challenge to the state's carbon auction, the capital gains tax challenge, and the long-term care insurance repeal. So all of those 3 failed. Haywood has really, though, been the face and the cash behind the small government movement lately in Washington. What was Haywood's take on Ferguson's moves?
Yeah, I mean, I talked with Haywood specifically through the lens of the issue of parents' rights, but we did talk a little bit, or he did touch a little bit on just the general function of Olympia. He is not a fan of, what the legislature does around taxes or some of the issues that he's, worked on. But when we opened our conversation, he was like, I was like, happy day after all the legislative session stuff is wrapped up. He's like, there's nothing happy about what happened in Olympia. So to say he's not pleased, I think would be fair. So I think now it's a matter of how does he address that through his preferred or main method, and that's initiatives. Right now, he's sort of considering what to do now, and whether it gets into more of that anti-tax territory remains to be seen, but certainly something that he's thinking about and that's on his radar.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up because we're going to take a little detour. That's the other reason we had you on the show is because of how Haywood might be shaping our ballot, this November? Talk to me about, you mentioned the Parents' Bill of Rights, right? The Let's Go Washington did collect signatures for it last year, but voters didn't actually weigh in on it because the legislature adopted it, hoping to keep it off the ballot. Then the Democrats changed it. So we've talked some about this legislation. All the changes have been super confusing to me, at least. So I'm just curious, what are parents' rights right now? What did Democrats change?
Yeah, I mean, parents' rights right now in terms of education are, they touch a lot, right? So parents have the right to access their kids', curriculum and classroom materials. They have the right to opt their kids out of things like comprehensive sex ed. They have the right to opt their kids out of surveys and certain questionnaires about their personal information. Parents have the right to immediate notification if their child is alleged to be a victim of, abuse of any kind or other sort of misconduct at school. They also have the right to have their kid on school grounds and things like that. There are rights that the bill removed. So the Parents' Rights Initiative essentially granted parents' rights or said in law that parents have the right to access any of their kids' school-based medical or mental health records.
And that's the version Haywood wanted.
And that's the version that Haywood and the supporters of that initiative wanted. But lawmakers came back and removed that language so that parents, in statute don't just have free access to that. There's a law that's been on the books in Washington state since like 1985 or something like that says any young person over the age of 13 years old has the ability to access, mental health care or substance use treatment without a parent's knowledge or consent. And so that was sort of in direct conflict with this parents' rights language.
So it seems like Brian Haywood isn't finished on initiatives, right? I mean, his last 3 were not successful, but Parents' Bill of Rights was adopted by the legislature. There were two other successes that the legislature passed. The ban on police pursuits was repealed. The income tax ban was included into law, although that was already banned in the state constitution. Did Haywood actually tell you what he's going to do next? Like, how's he going to approach initiatives differently next time?
Yeah, so, I mean, he has filed an initiative to repeal the changes to the Parents' Rights Initiative, essentially restoring the Parents' Rights Initiative law in full, undoing the work that lawmakers did on it this session. He's filed that initiative. He said, we're absolutely doing it. I don't think that Let's Go Washington is gathering signatures for it yet. Their website doesn't have petitions. Haywood sort of talked about, working on it after the next couple of weeks or an announcement or...
He's got to have the right pens to come in, right?
Exactly.
People need...
That's the secret.
Yeah, the right pens will result in a successful initiative signature gathering campaign.
Wow, you've been Ferguson brainwashed on these pens.
I just had the Ferguson's pen pressed to my temple and my eyes wide open right now.
That's actually exactly what he said. No, I'm just kidding. But so the parents' rights thing is definitely going to be an effort that Let's Go Washington, undertakes. And he's filed that initiative as an initiative to the people, which gives the Let's Go Washington until, I think, July 3rd to submit more than 308,000 signatures of people who are in support of that repeal, which is a pretty high bar. But, I mean, they gathered a ton of signatures on that natural gas thing last year, so it's not impossible. As far as other issues, he wasn't totally clear with me about what else Let's Go Washington might really try to get done this year. I think that there's still some feelers being put out on that, or just some behind the scenes work to see what might have the support. But he certainly is considering a range of things from, tax stuff to insurance, payments from parents about, stuff that their kids do. And then he also talked a little bit about another initiative he's filed around girls' sports and trans athletes. So that could also be something that comes up, but it's really sort of a TBD. We should know more relatively soon.
So that's coming up in November, potentially, if Brian gets enough signatures, if he gathers enough, if he passes out enough pens. We're going to be watching that. But for now, Olympia is quiet, I assume. Jeannie, what is it like down there?
Yeah, it's like lawmakers left and all of the, landscaping work and construction around here started. Oh. It does get noisy in the hallways.
Yeah,
sometimes there's field trips that still come down here. But yeah, it sort of turns into a little bit of a ghost town. So quiet
Jeannie,
for now.
Yeah. Well, Jeannie Lindsay, you're the state government reporter for KUOW. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And that's it for Sound Politics today. Our show is produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Gabriel Spitzer. I'm KUOW politics reporter Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkman. And please remember, the show is only possible because of support from listeners like you. Consider a donation to keep us going at KUOW.org/politics. We will not spend it on pens, I promise.
Oh, you came around on the pen thing. I was wondering if it was going to happen.
You won me over.
Oh, yay. It only took 3 takes. We'll see you next week.